This is the Garden Cinema Film Talk, presented by Michael Chambers and Abla Kandelaft. We chat with filmmakers, actors, producers, and film commentators about the art of film. We talk about the films they made, how they made them, and the ones they'd like to make. This week, Michael and I are delighted to welcome José Arroyo on the podcast. José is Associate Professor in Film Studies at Warwick University. We invited him to mark our upcoming Penelope Cruz season and to talk more generally about the actress, Almodovar and Spanish cinema. Thank you very much, José, for joining us. You've got quite an interesting take on some of his films. You're quite critical about certain films. I listened to your review of Parallel Mothers. Right. And it was a very rich review. And you're not sure about, if I'm right, about the tone of it, if it quite achieves what it sets out to do.
Yes, I'm afraid I'm in the minority of people who didn't feel it worked. Though there was also a distinction between Spanish critics and critics abroad. Spanish critics had much more problems with it.
Well, because of the Civil War.
Because of the way it was treated, because, so the film's intent is to reveal it, yeah. But on the other hand, it kind of couches it in this middle of the film that takes up 80% of it, and that kind of allegorizes it.
So did they feel it wasn't given enough weight or seriousness?
They felt that there were almost two films, and if you're really making a film, about acknowledging the past and kind of, acknowledging the Civil War and taking care of it properly and so on, then what do you need that 80, minute sequence in the middle for?
Yeah, and I imagine the right wing in Spain was rather unhappy about this.
Well, yes, I mean that's
another question.
That's another question because they hate everything.
They hate everything. Yeah.
It's
no doubt about it.
Yeah,
you're talking more about the liberal and left reaction.
Yes, kind of. Yeah, I mean, with the right wing, they just hate him. Period. Really.
Well, that's. I can imagine there must be so.
Yes.
Tackling this subject of the Franco years and the massacres and so on, it needs to have a film to itself.
It needs to be about that.
You can't drop it into a romantic comedy.
That's right. Well, yeah. But it must be said that, there hasn't really been a film about that yet, and there are reasons, right? So, you do need to allegorize or have a delicate.
So perhaps that was as far as he could really go on.
Yes, I did wonder that. And he had been working on it for a very, very long time. And clearly, I'm in the minority because it's been a huge success.
I liked it.
You liked it, yeah, Parallel Mothers.
I liked it, but compared to a film like Voltaire.
Yes, or Talk to Her.
Yeah.
Right? Films like those, which are, though, I do think he's a truly great filmmaker. So even something that, like Parallel Mothers is of interest for many, many reasons. Mm-hmm. Not the least of Penelope Cruz, who was fantastic.
Well, in a way, with Parallel Mothers, there was more skill in the grave issue, the beginning and end.
Yes.
There was more skill, especially in the ending, than it was ever shown in the long middle section.
Though I also didn't like the ending, you see, but that's maybe more for personal reasons.
Why is that?
What the ending did is it brought together all the people who'd been fighting for the issue, who had relatives. Yeah. Whereas my feeling is the whole village should have come together, right? Because actually, I think, it's now been 4 or 5 generations, right? So, we're all of mixed parentage, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, there must be very few people who can say, I come only from, a Republican family, or I come on, it would have been great had the film convinced, and therefore the whole village comes to march. In other countries, I think in Britain, well, you'd have to go back maybe to Mosley, but he didn't run the country.
No, we didn't have
exactly. Well, that's what I'm saying, but Mosley was the fascist leader.
Yeah, but he didn't last long. It's easy for us.
Yes. I mean, what makes me angry in Spain is that people did have it. So this romanticizing of it. Because the thing about that type of personal fascism is, the insecurity of it was that you didn't know. So you could break the law one day and nothing would happen. And the next day, you just happen to, I don't know, throw a paper on the floor or something, and you get beaten up and jailed. And, your family has to pay a ransom for you. So
What's happened with the Catholic Church in Spain? How does it deal with the Franco years?
It supports them. It praises them.
Still does.
Yeah, I mean, the Opus Dei organization is still very, very powerful in Spain. Yeah. A lot of the education, a lot of the private education is still done through Catholic schools. Yeah. So I think there's been a loss. I mean, the faith in Spain was always kind of coercive, So, for example, you needed a priest's recommendation to get a job. You needed a baptism certificate. So people have lost their faith. Yes, people are not going to church, because they don't have to. Whereas before you had to, right? So, but that hasn't lessened the institutional power or the economic wealth.
To get back to the season.
Yes.
I have a question for you, Michael. Why specifically Penelope Cruz and, for example, not a season about Almodovar films? What is it about her as an actress that you wanted to focus on?
Well, an Almodovar season would have been probably better, and we can do it. I mean, one doesn't preclude another, and we'll develop seasons for years. We haven't yet done a director's season. They've been actors' seasons.
So on the one hand, you think, well, Almodovar is so present. Why would you do a retrospective on him? Everyone knows his films, right? On the other hand, I mean, I do think that there are elements that, there are films that have been shown more than others, and there are ways of showcasing them,
If we go back to his old films, there's a lot to show.
And that you could directly address at a contemporary gay, trans, feminist audience. I mean, Labyrinths of Passion and what have I done to deserve this? I mean, I saw Labyrinths of Passion in Madrid when I was first encountering his films in a cinema, and it was like the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Everyone knew the lines, they were voicing them, they were completely participating in the screening. It's kind of like a completely different way of, seeing those works that now seem a bit rough and crude. And
because you wrote the introduction to his early 16mm film.
I did all the introductions to the first box set of DVDs. So I think Pepe Lucibon. Yeah. I mean, that's fabulous. And actually, the film is a record of, the underground art scene in Madrid, Because what happened is after Franco died, because there's been so many, nobody believed anything, right? So, there was an explosion of pornography and drugs and, all the things that had been forbidden before, right? And kind of people didn't quite know how to deal with them. So, heroin addiction in Madrid, just mushroomed, and lots of people died as a result of that. And then, of course, lots of people died of AIDS, often through shared needles. And they're all in these films. Because there were all these young people making art together, right? Some in bands.
But you were too young to know this, really?
Well, I was too young to know that, and I lived in a foreign country. So I grew up in Canada. I was always we did go back every summer, but I have that kind of relationship to it, which it's always a bit removed. Yeah. So, I mean, I got excited by Almodovar seeing his films at the Toronto Film Festival. I went to interview him. Before he got really big. So he lived in this little flat that kind of, where he did most of his work. And he was obsessively rewinding. Written on the Wind? Yeah, the scene where the daughter has been brought in by the cops, and the father goes up the stairs and she's dancing wildly. Yeah, and then he has a heart attack on the stairs and tumbles over. And he kept watching that over and over and over and over again.
Have you read his novels, The Fire in the Gut?
Yes, Fuego en las Entrañas, that's right. I have, they're very camp, that's all I can say about them. I'm not surprised that he made movies, and I think he considers himself a writer, but, he's someone who writes with a camera for sure.
Would you say he's not just unique, but way out in his difference from every other filmmaker?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think, you could see his filmmaking style as, indebted to Hitchcock, and Buñuel, and John Waters, and very much Douglas Sirk. Yeah, like that kind of glossy melodrama. The reason why his films are funny or why they're popular, because he always grounds them in a kind of common sense. So you have, the thing about his films, in his early films, if you remember, his mother would always come out. And she just spoke like a Spanish peasant. I'd hear my aunts and her expressions and her voice. It was like really, get on with life. And so then you can have drag queens and you can have, people who go to Paris and get their tits and fuck with their father, whatever. So he would always, like his early films have these wild stories. Yeah. But the emotional exchanges are always grounded in a kind of... And you always have, like, in What Have I Done to Deserve This? The mother, you can completely understand her and where she's coming from. It's really emotionally legible. But of course the situation is absurd, forging Hitler's diaries. Selling her son to the dentist. Like, all of that stuff.
Here's a question. How did you come up with this selection of films? Why this particular selection of films for this season? What links them together?
Showing the Parallel Mothers.
Volver. All About My Mother.
I did one of the early Guardian talks with Almodovar, and it's my belief, and he agreed with it, that Live Flesh was the film where Penelope Cruz really became an actress. That until then she'd been a leading lady, incredibly charismatic and beautiful and funny, right? Like, but, it's her role as the prostitute mother in only, it must be 10, 20 minutes in the film that she's in only. But, that she really began, it's their first film together. And so really demonstrated kind of what she could do.
We're sharing that early film with, looks like one of the first she made with Javier Bardem.
Jamon? Yeah.
That is really Buñuelian. It's a melodrama, but it's kind of really crude in a very funny, critical, corrosive way. Yeah. And it's where Javier Bardem does his nude bullfight. So yes, and she's marvelous. She's so beautiful in that. It's Bigas Luna who there's an increase in interest in his work now. There's been recent retrospectives. He really is kind of, quite a unique filmmaker in Spain as well. He's Catalan. And he's got this real kind of sensibility where things are crude and exaggerated. Yeah, it's like he did one called Golden Balls with Javier Bardem, where you have this transition where a character is told, well, if you really want to get ahead, you have to marry your boss's wife. And he zips up his pants. You see this construction job going, and before you know it, he's married the boss's wife. He's leading a construction company. He's building a skyscraper. And, it's all just like 3 or 4 shots dissolved into 10 seconds, right?
Is Jamon Jamon his most famous film?
Well, this is Jamon Jamon, Golden Balls, and The Tit in the Moon are part of a trilogy. So maybe The Tit in the Moon was the more successful one, though they all were, and increasingly so. So
should we talk a bit more about Almodovar?
Sure.
It's obviously something, he's a filmmaker that you're very impressed by, and you've devoted time to him. And
Yes, my initial interest in him was just as a gay man, right? I think the first film I saw was The Law of Desire, and I was the child of Spanish immigrants. The Spain I knew was rural, poor, illiterate, backward, right? And then all of a sudden to see this film, which was a gay melodrama, in which everyone was at ease with their sexuality and glamorous and so on. I just couldn't believe that this was being made in Spain, because actually no Hollywood film had dared make anything like that at that point, right? No Canadian film or French film, or you had not seen anything like that before. So that it should come from Spain, really, it made you think, what's going on? So that was the first interest, was just a personal one. And over the years, because it took him a while to become a good filmmaker. he wasn't always. So he always had a sensibility. I mean, I love films like What Have I Done to Deserve This? But it is also quite crude, yeah? And actually what you see as time goes on is that, he becomes a great filmmaker. I mean, he can tell stories in ways that are very complex, but that seem quite easy and fluid, where the camera's always in the right place. Yeah, so he wasn't always like that.
Did you see a progression then in terms of his filmmaking?
Yes.
From those days? Do you think now it's perhaps a safer type of filmmaking? He's experimenting a bit?
No, I think he's very daring still. I mean, if you see, his run of films in the last 10, 15 years, The Skin I Live In, that's a very daring film, right? Talk to Her is a very daring film. It's, he's always been incredibly brave. Yeah, to make a film in which you offer sympathy to the rapist, right? Because that's what happens at the heart of Talk to Her is a rape. And yet, he's not thrown to the wolves. He's not made unknowable. You understand, empathize. Of course, you can't agree. Yeah, so he makes things morally complex and ambiguous in the way that great filmmakers do. I mean, I think Broken Embraces, which I hope you're showing, because I think that deserves a revival. I think it's a truly great film, because it's not just a film about the story it tells you. Yeah, but it's a film about cinema. Again, it's a meta film. I mean, it's incredible. Penelope Cruz, it's hard to say whether she's at her most beautiful in Volver or here, right? Because here they do these kinds of tests, which, she has to pretend she's Audrey Hepburn or Marilyn or, and, she plays like a kind of prostitute named Séverine, like Catherine Deneuve in Belle de Jour. And so the film is about her, about her character, wanting to be an actress and, but also her affair with this rich industrialist that permits and then blocks that filmmaking. So that's one level of the story. But the other level is, about cinema, right? So there's a wonderful scene where the filmmaker who's been blinded by this rich industrialist is told by his caretaker, what can I do to make you feel a bit better? And he says, oh, play me the sound of Jean Moreau's voice, right? Yeah, who thinks that? Yeah, it's a filmmaker who's involved with the whole history of cinema and who's commenting on it and deploying it.
But I was interested in your take as someone who knows a lot about Almodovar's filmography. What do you make of this kind of Almodovar, Penelope Cruz, their working relationship?
Yeah, I mean, lucky both of them, because I think he's always done that. So, when he began his career, it was Carmen Maura who played the central character in all of those early 80s films. Then from the 90s onwards, it was like Victoria Abril, right, who did that. And in fact, Penelope Cruz says that watching Victoria Abril in Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down was what made her want to be an actress. Right? And then, of course, there's now this extraordinary run of films with Penelope Cruz. He hasn't had that kind of relationship with any male except Antonio Banderas. And clearly, he presents her with all of these different challenges because they are, quite extraordinary and extraordinarily different films, right? I mean, in Volver, basically, she's playing a Sofia Loren role. Whereas, I mean, in Parallel Mothers, she's playing a professional woman. And Carne Tremula, she's a rural peasant prostitute in Madrid, right?
Do you find her always well cast in that role, given this they're always so diverse?
I do, and she's done extraordinary things for other people. It's not just she hasn't just shone with Almodovar. There's a fantastic film which now escapes me by Diego Yanez, where Victoria Abril and Penelope Cruz play angels. So Penelope Cruz is being punished by God. She's in purgatory, and Victoria Abril is the good angel. So what is the film's idea of heaven? Is to sing samba in a bar in Paris, right? That's Victoria Abril. What's the film's idea of hell? Is, for a gangster, to have to work as a prostitute and as a waitress in real life. That's the character Penelope Cruz plays, right? So she has to evoke the idea that she's a macho gangster, who's died and is now basically, in purgatory on his way to hell, being made to suffer what he's
Who's the director?
It's Diego Llanes, I think. And A un Dios desconocido, To an Unknown God, I think. And Fanny Ardant is in it as well. So she's extraordinary in that. Well, what I would recommend, is to show a program of young contemporary Spanish filmmakers. Because I don't know if you've noticed, but this year they won all the awards, basically. I was reading in El País yesterday, that this whole new wave of Spanish filmmakers, have been winning all these awards in the festival circuit this year. And there are other filmmakers like Albert Serra and so on, who basically have not been shown abroad, right? And yet they're major figures, like, Albert Serra was in Cannes, in competition, I think, this year, right? So it's a new group of filmmakers. Yeah, it's there might be a 10-year gap between them, but they're part of the same thing. And I think really, quite exciting. Much more knowledgeable. Also, I think much more European. It's people who who now make a living. You do a film from Spain, but you might direct a commercial in Berlin,
It's the erosion of national boundaries. The French still seem to make French films. I
think they all make Spanish films or Italian films or whatever. But I think the world they inhabit is larger, So you often see a film which is a Spanish film set in Barcelona, but it will have an episode in Berlin is the de facto capital, so they'll often be in other places. They used to be in London all the time, but no more. So I think the flavor of the films, there's a kind of sensibility, a way of speaking and making sense that remains very local. Yeah. But the world that the characters go through is just larger. Would
you say there's something in common they have, apart from, being European?
I really can't answer that because, you see, a reason for showing this season is that a lot of these films have not circulated here. I live here, so I only have access to what I can see here. Yeah. Or, when I go visit my parents, like, you catch what you can. So I'm going by what the press is. But the people that I have seen, are, something to see. And again, something really different than that previous generation, which I mentioned earlier, of Medemby, Luna, and Almodovar. It's kind of... and Albert Serra is definitely one of the most talked about kind of young filmmakers.
Actually, a question about Penelope Cruz, maybe for you, Michael, is I noticed most of the films we're showing are Spanish films made in Spain, not films made in Hollywood. Oh yes, Vicky Cristina Barcelona, that's it.
Yeah. And that'll have to be carefully handled because there's such an anti-Woody thing at the moment.
Well,
yes. No, I feel the same way, but...
Well, we're showing it and we'll see what happens. I think generally we select films on their merits. A good film goes in.
Have you seen there's an Italian film that she did quite early on called something like Non te movere, Don't Move, where she plays a real down and out drug addict prostitute, and she's like fantastic in that. Yeah, and I think she might have won the Best Actress prize in Venice or something. It was a lauded role, but it's not a great movie. Yeah, she's great in the movie. So that might be a reason why it's not necessarily a film that has lasted, though. Yeah.
Well, it's a question we've asked before about Brigitte Bardot. Can you show a film on the strength of the actor, or the strength? It has to be a very good film.
Well, my view is that a film, if we're showing a film, the film's got to be good. I don't want to show a bad film because it's got a great actor in it.
Though sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish because the actor could be so great that the film turns into something else.
That can happen, but then you've got a good film.
Exactly. Yes, I felt that way, because I've been in Bologna, in Ritrovato, and they had a Sofia Loren season, and they showed some of her films, which were like, Pan, Amore e, I think it's Scandal in Sorrento or something like that, is the English title. And in a way it's kind of, quite a basic Italian comedy. But it's got Victoria De Sica and Sofia Loren both doing farce and both marvelous, right? Yeah. And of course, she's so astonishingly beautiful on that big screen. Yeah. It's like dazzling.
Yes, it works both ways, doesn't it? A bad actor can destroy a good film.
Yes, though again, if if it destroys it, then as you say, it's not a good film. Yeah. Yeah. Though, I think one of my colleagues used to have this thing about films that don't play, but that are great. So his example was always something like Magnificent Ambersons. Yeah. The ending was destroyed. The film is not complete. It doesn't quite play with an audience, in an immediate emotional way.
Disappointing film.
Well, I think it's a film that lingers in the mind, and the more you see it, the greater it becomes. It's one of those films that if you've heard it's great, then you see it and you go, and then something will stick in your mind that will make you want to see it again.
To go back to Penelope Cruz, are there films where you feel she doesn't play to her strengths?
It's hard for me to say because I really like her. Yeah, and I find her beautiful and I find her skilled and I like the way she moves. To me, there are films in which I feel she's a bit wasted. And actually, I would say that Almodovar's All About My Mother is a film in which any ingenue could have played that role. She's just a pretty nun, isn't she? Yeah, who's got a few problems with her mother. I don't think it's a role that stretches her. I've never seen her be bad, but I've seen her be very bland, like in international co-productions like Captain Corelli's Mandolin and things like that. I mean, she's one of those people who initially you think, well, it's just a pretty girl, right? Like, it's not to be sneezed at, someone with that kind of beauty. But actually, it's when they grow into, the acting and then surprise you with it. I mean, I do compare her to Sofia Loren because, Sofia Loren could have had a fantastic career just being beautiful, right? But then the fact that she could play comedy and different kinds of comedy, right? Like she could do pratfalls, she could do farce, she could do sophisticated comedy, and she could do, kind of Una Giornata Particolare or Two Women, right? Then that becomes kind of genuinely extraordinary. And I do think that Penelope Cruz is like that, that she's got that beauty, right? But then she can also kind of do much else. And it is, I think, very rare. I think it's really only the very greatest, that can provide that. And harder still when the women begin as, kind of beautiful sex symbols.
And then to see them as they get older, what they do.
And to see them, kind of what they do as they get older. Again, some people just become, better and better. I mean, Ava Gardner, in her declining years was wonderful, and her beauty became even more touching, because it was because she was losing it. There was something haunting about that, right? And of course, some people kind of disappear, really. I mean, I was having a discussion with a friend, because we were talking about these people who continue to matter, and people who just, the culture, I mean, film buffs like me might know them, but who in the culture remembers Lana Turner anymore? Yeah, who was like almost the connection to Ava Gardner, right? I mean, they might even have seen Imitation of Life or something like that. A Postman Always Rings Twice, but they probably wouldn't even be able to name her as a star. Yeah.
Well, that's funny. Only last week we spoke to Dr. Lucy Bolton, who co-edited a book about lasting stars, the lasting power of stars, and what makes for lasting stardom. And that was really interesting. And we talked specifically about Marlene Dietrich and actresses around that time period.
That's also kind of, interesting. Someone like Dietrich continues to be alive in the culture in all kinds of interesting ways. Someone like Garbo, who was so ahead of her all their life in so many different ways, now seems to, just be a figure of the movies, not of the culture, So that's, one can't predict that, I don't.
We just have to see whether Penelope Cruz...
Well, I mean, I think she's very lucky in a way, and she must have been very clever because, I mean, I think we forget now, maybe, the kind of prejudice there was in Hollywood and, by extension, international cinema against Hispanic actresses, which I think is different than Italian or because of the way that what Hispanic means in America. So I used to have a theory that people who were Hispanic in the US could never become top stars. Yeah, because, a star is someone that has to signify in the culture, that has to mean something, that people have to identify with, right? I mean, somebody like Sidney Poitier's triumph is that, or Denzel Washington, they overcome the racism. And
they had to do that.
But they had to do that, right? And my theory is that someone like Antonio Banderas didn't become as big a star as he could have.
I did see her recently, along with Javier Bardem, in this, to my mind, terrible film about the gangster. You must know it. Bardem plays the drug lord. It was named after the famous gangster. He was a Colombian gangster.
The Pablo Escobar.
Escobar. And it was terrible. And it was in English. And Bardem, you could hardly understand a word he said. Whether he sort of went on strike and said, I'm not cooperating on this rubbish, or he finds English very difficult to speak.
Well, he has a very thick accent, though. It's gotten much better over the years, right?
Well, in this film, you could hardly understand a word he said. Penelope Cruz, her heart wasn't in it, so she just sailed through it without any effort. And it was terrible.
Well, part of the reason why I'm so glad of the existence of the cinema is that things have become very difficult to see, right? So, there are fewer cinemas left. What they show, even in the independent cinemas, is really the mainstream cinema. But to say that those things, do not come your way easily. So I'm not surprised I haven't seen it, though I do see a lot.
Well, Escobar is one you could happily forget.
I'm very hopeful about Penelope Cruz having, a career like Simone Signoret's or, some of the people who've lasted. Because, and like Sofia Loren, she's someone who, would make Hollywood films, but she always made Italian films. And I think Penelope Cruz has always made films in Spain, right? She hasn't been worried about the money or the budgets, right? She's gone for the projects and the filmmakers.
Well, she does Escobar to pay the bills and then a European film for the love of it.
It's a mystery. That film is a mystery. It was huge budget, you could see. The scenes.
But also, I think one of the things about actors' careers as well is who cares about the flops? Like kind of, what audiences are interested in is the things that delight and mean and so on. The flops don't matter if there's work that compensates for it. Really. And I think with Penelope Cruz's career, there's already a whole string of those films.
Well, looking forward to the season then.
And now she has
Jose, thanks so much for your time.
It's a delightful discussion.
This was the Garden Cinema Film Talk. You can find out more about the cinema screenings and seasons on our website, thegardencinema.co.uk, and follow us, send us comments and feedback on our social media, @The Garden Cinema. Thank you for listening.